Good afternoon, this is Stephen Haynes and I'll be presenting Rural Water Supply in the 21st Century, Part 1, What's Required for Success. Before we move on, I'll give you a little bit on my background. I've got over 20 years in the fire service, both in suburban and rural fire departments, including 3.5 years as the chief of a rural fire department in Connecticut. I've also got over 27 years in the oil and gas industry, which most of my time in that industry has been spent trying to figure out how to generate high flow rates using both fixed systems and mobile pumping equipment. When I first started in the industry in 1989, it was pretty common to be looking for 5,000 gallon a minute. Now we're looking at flow rates of 17,000 to 20,000 gallon a minute. Quite commonly, as the size of our storage tanks have gotten larger and larger over the years. As I was doing all this work, a lot of my friends have said you really ought to try to take some of your ideas in the rural fire service and write a book about it. Well, I just really don't have the stomach to write a book, so I figure I'm going to try this video presentation concept instead. I hope you enjoy it. If you have any comments or questions, you can contact me at my email address shown there on the screen. So at the end of the day, to put a fire out, all we really need is adequate flow and application. I mean, we all pretty much understand that if the GPM available to the fire department exceeds the GPM required to extinguish the fire should go out. We often refer to this as the critical flow rate or the needed fire flow. One of the things that folks often lose track of is that as that needed fire flow rate increases, so does the amount of time that you're going to have to sustain that flow rate. The reason I say this is as the fire expands, the quantity of walls, ceilings, windows, doors, furniture, just objects in the way of proper hose stream application is going to increase. So it's going to take you more and more time to work your way around these things. The last item here really is just kind of pointing out that, hey, there may be times where it may be best to reserve your water in the bank as you take care of other things to save it so that you can really make a hard knock on the fire once you've got the resources in place to exceed that critical flow rate. When it comes to adequate application, the water must be applied to the fuel that is burning or about to ignite. And this, in a lot of cases, includes superheated smoke, particularly in today's modern furnishings where we're dealing with a lot of synthetic fuels. The water must also be applied across the burning surface or into the bulk of the smoke that is burning or about to ignite. We can't try to extinguish a 1,000 square foot home by putting water in a 10 square foot corner of the building. You're just not going to gain control. Also, your streams have to have sufficient bulk and girth to get the water to the fuel or into the bulk of those gases. It doesn't do any good if we're using very small caliber streams that are evaporating before they reach the seat of that material. The other thing to keep in mind is we're not just fighting the fire that's in front of us, but we're fighting the bulk of the fire that's either below us or upwind of us. So we really need to control these bulk fire areas before we start moving into extension. The example I give here is if we're trying to curb extension into the first floor kitchen, we're going to lose the house if we're not dealing with that bulk fire in the basement, because that heat release rate from the basement is fighting us. It's evaporating our water. It's actually adding to the fire, drying materials out as quickly as we're wetting them. So you've got to deal with that bulk fire first. So how do we determine our critical flow rate? There are several formulas available from the NFPA, the National Fire Academy, and several other sources. I prefer the NFA quick fire flow formula because it's simple. Basically, it's critical flow is equal to the length times the width of your building times the number of stories times the percent of involvement divided by 3. For every exposure, whether it's internal or external around the box, so to speak, we're going to add 25% for each of them. We've got an example. We've got a 2-story wood frame dwelling with a ground area of about 20 by 30. So our critical flow is 20 by 30 times 2 for the number of stories divided by 3. So 400 gallon a minute of attack lines and backup lines should bring us into control, be able to control this building if it were fully involved. If the building was 30% involved upon arrival, we only need about 120 gallon a minute. One of the things to keep in mind, typically when I'm dealing with wood frame structures, I'm always going to do my calculation here as if the entire building's involved, and I'm going to adjust it based on the percent of involvement. It's just simpler because there's really no fire containment between floors in a wood frame building unless you're into a very high life risk building where they've added fire resistant rated ceilings and other things. So over the next couple slides, we're going to take a look at the time versus fire growth curves for representative buildings. One of the things to keep in mind is typically along the time axis of the curve, I like to use the percent of building involvement, because I don't want to talk about minutes and seconds because that varies so much based from building to building. The thing to keep in mind is that any particular degree of building involvement, there's a critical flow rate that must be established to achieve control, and there's also a critical amount of time that we have to sustain that flow rate for. As the percentage of building involvement increases, so's the complexity of getting our hose streams put into the right place at the right time. So your time element also increases for your fire flow requirement. The other thing to keep in mind too is that neither your critical flow or your duration peak at 100% of building involvement. Matter of fact, in a lot of cases, it may continue to grow, particularly when you have cases with heavy exposures, a lot of buildings nearby, or buildings of highly combustible construction. So the graph in front of you here represents a free burn with no exposures. Along the bottom axis is our percent of involvement, 0 to 100%. At this point, past this point, the fire is actually extended into our exposures. The red curve is based on this axis over here, which is percent of our worst case fire flow, or our needed fire flow. So here's 100% of our needed fire flow for our building. As you can see, it continues to grow as our percentage of involvement increases. It actually stays kind of flat in this case as the fire extends into our exposures, and then finally starts to decrease as our fire runs out of fuel. The blue curve is the amount of time that we have to sustain that needed fire flow for. So as you can see, once again, as our percentage of involvement increases, so does the relative amount of time that we must maintain our critical fire flow for. In this case here, we've taken the graph and we've placed this yellow area in the background to say, within this region is where we're going to have our worst case risk or potential for fire spread into our exposures. We still may have some risk in here, particularly where we've got buildings that are close, but when you get into that 70-80% of involvement range, the radiant heat generally gets pretty out of control. You've got a lot of issues as far as embers and burning materials falling from the building, and possibly even collapse. It's going to cause rapid fire spread into your exposures. So we typically are going to use this area, this yellow area is going to kick off somewhere around the 70 to 80% range in almost all the graphs that we're going to talk about. So when everything works right for us, the fire basically goes out, or generally goes out, at about the same degree of involvement in which we found it. And when that happens, a couple of things have happened here, right? We've had operational flow rates exceeded the critical flow rate. The duration of water exceeded the required duration, and we had good stream placement and application. And the thing to keep in mind is this is true whether we planned our operation to go this way or we just got lucky. So the next two graphs are going to show two common cases where success occurs, and we'll talk about why it occurred. So in this case here, the fire's been growing. The initial assignment arrives on location. The building's about 30% involved. At this point in time, the needed fire flow is at this level. This is what the fire flow capacity of the initial assignment is. And when I talk about the initial assignment, it's usually the rigs that are able to arrive within the first 20 minutes. So our fire flow capacity is greater than needed fire flow. We've got a pretty good duration of flow. So because we've got enough water, enough fire flow, and enough water to sustain it, the fire's brought under control rather rapidly. So we've got sufficient flow rate for the initial assignment. This is our objective in most cases. This is what we want to see at the end of the day. In this case, the same initial assignment is dispatched to another fire. The fire's grown to be about 30% involved. However, when they get there, because of the size of this building, they've got sufficient fire flow capacity. They've got the pump capacity, nozzles, and hose lines to handle the flow capacity. The problem is that they don't have enough water to sustain it long enough. So what ends up happening is at this point here, they run out of water shortly after they start their application. The fire's been knocked down. It's going to sit here. It's going to take a couple minutes, but it's going to start back up, and it's going to follow that same curve that it was before. We've just kind of temporarily slowed it down. Luckily for them, they were in the process of putting a sustained water supply into play while they were fighting the fire. The sustained water supply comes into service at about this point with a capacity that's up in this area that's well above the needed fire flow. So at this point here, the fire is going to be brought under control. So in summary, only three things are really required to achieve successful extinguishment. First, the fire department's available water flow capacity has to exceed the needed fire flow or critical fire flow required for the fire. The water supply must last long enough to support the critical fire flow. and the water supply has to be used properly. The hose streams have to be properly applied in order to achieve extinguishment. This sounds simple enough, but it's often very difficult to achieve in reality. In part 2 of this series, we're going to look at why we often fail to achieve extinguishment, particularly in the rural environment. Once again, this is Stephen Haynes. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation. I hope you find it useful and hope to hear some feedback from you. My contact information is listed below. Take care and stay safe.